Find the full Elizabeth Bathory story in the Paladin app.
Nobody has
I've said all I came to say.
This is the image that they think they can cage us to the
History remembers her as the most prolific murderer who ever lived. A noblewoman who tortured and killed hundreds of young girls. A monster who bathed in their blood to keep herself young forever. The original vampire, they say. The dark inspiration behind a century of horror stories. A name whispered like a curse. The Blood Countess. The number attached to her is staggering. 650 victims. A figure so enormous it would make her the worst serial killer in recorded history. Worse than any name you have ever heard. And yet, when you go looking for the proof, something strange happens. The bloodbath vanishes. The 650 melts away to almost nothing you can stand on. The monster begins to look less like a killer caught in the act, and more like the most powerful woman in the kingdom, brought down by men who had a great deal to gain from her ruin. This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, not the legend, but the woman underneath it, and the question that has haunted her name for 400 years. Was she a monster, or was she the victim of the perfect crime? This is the truth behind the Blood Countess. Using advanced AI trained on the surviving trial records, the letters and estate documents of the Hungarian nobility, the accounts of the churchmen and officials who moved against her, and the work of the historians who have spent lifetimes untangling fact from folklore, we have reconstructed her world and her downfall. To understand how a real woman became the most famous monster in history, you must first understand just how much power she held and exactly who stood to profit when that power was destroyed.
I kept my own name.
Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the greatest families in all of Central Europe. The Bathory name was one of the most powerful in the region, a dynasty that produced princes, warlords, and even a king. Her own cousin ruled as a monarch, and her family commanded vast lands, private armies, and influence that reached to the very top of the kingdom. She was raised in the world of the high aristocracy, and she was given something almost no woman of her age received, a real education. She could read and write fluently, reportedly in several languages, at a time when many noblemen, even kings, were barely literate. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and born to command. This matters because everything that would later be said about her rests on a simple fact. She was not a helpless woman on the margins of power. She was near the center of it. She was the kind of person who kept records, managed fortunes, ran courts of law on her own lands, and answered to almost no one. And in the world she was born into, that combination, a woman alone holding that much power, was not admired. It was a problem. At around the age of 15, she was married, in a union of two great houses, to a nobleman named Ferenc Nádasdy. He was a soldier, and a famous one, a commander so feared on the battlefield against the Ottoman Turks that he earned a grim nickname, the Black Knight of Hungary. As part of the marriage, the couple came into possession of a fortress that would become the center of the entire legend, the castle of Csejte, perched on a hill above the Hungarian countryside, surrounded by villages and farmland and lands that stretched for miles. But here is the crucial part. Ferenc was a warrior, and warriors are away at war. For years at a time, he was gone, commanding armies on distant frontiers, which meant that the person actually running the estates, managing the money, settling the disputes, commanding the servants and the men, holding the whole enterprise together, was not the Black Knight. It was his wife. Elizabeth spent much of her marriage effectively ruling a small kingdom by herself. And then, in 1604, Ferenc Nádasdy died, and a widow of the high nobility, with no husband to answer to, inherited it all. The castles, the fortunes, the lands, the private soldiers. Elizabeth Bathory was now one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the kingdom, and one of the very few of them who happened to be a woman. She was, in the cold arithmetic of her age, an enormous concentration of wealth, with no man standing over it, a prize waiting for someone to claim. The dark rumors, when they come, arrive slowly. In the years around the turn of the century, whispers began to spread through the villages beneath the castle. Servant girls, sent to work in the Countess's household, were said to be dying. These girls came from poor families, sent up to the great house to serve, as was utterly ordinary in that world, and some of them, the rumours said, did not come home. A local Lutheran pastor, the man responsible for the parish, is said to have grown uneasy at the number of quiet burials, at bodies brought down from the castle to be put in the ground. Now, we must be honest here about what these rumours are and are not. Life in a great household of this era was brutal by our standards. Servants were treated as property. Disease was everywhere, and death, especially among the poor and overworked, was common and rarely questioned. Cruelty by the powerful toward those beneath them was widespread and almost never punished. Something was happening in that castle. The accounts are too persistent to wave away entirely. But the truth of it is buried under everything that came later. What we can say is this: for years, these rumours circulated and nothing happened. No investigation, no arrest. The most powerful woman in the region carried on, untouched. And that silence itself is telling. In that world, an accusation against someone so highly placed was almost unthinkable unless someone more powerful still was willing to make it. A single peasant family had no path to justice against the mistress of the castle. Their grief simply disappeared into the ground with their daughters. So the rumours sat there for years, harmless to her, dangerous only on the day that someone with real power decided they were useful. Until, quite suddenly, that day came. And when it came, the change had almost nothing to do with justice for dead servant girls, and almost everything to do with money and politics at the very highest level of the kingdom. To understand what happened next, follow the debt. The Nádasdy family had loaned an enormous sum of money to the crown, to the king himself. This was common among the great noble houses. Kings were often cash poor and borrowed heavily from their wealthiest subjects. But when Ferenc died, that debt did not die with him. It passed to his widow, which meant that the king now owed a vast fortune to Elizabeth Bathory. And a king who owes a fortune to a widow has a very interesting set of options. If that widow could be discredited, accused of monstrous crimes, stripped of her standing, her name destroyed, then the debt might quietly vanish. Her enormous lands might be confiscated and redistributed. The problem of the powerful, independent woman and the problem of the inconvenient debt might both be solved at a single stroke. Enter the man who would lead the case against her, the Paladin, the second most powerful man in the kingdom after the king, the highest official in the land. And he was not a stranger to Elizabeth. He was, by the ties of that tightly interwoven aristocracy, connected to her own family, a kinsman, a man from her own web of relations. He was also a shrewd political operator, and the person the king entrusted to investigate the Countess. Many historians looking at this arrangement have pointed to an uncomfortable truth. The man investigating her had every political reason to want her found guilty, and the outcome that destroyed her also happened to be the outcome that served the crown, cleared the debt, and freed up her lands. A guilty countess, it turned out, was worth a great deal more to powerful men than an innocent one. The blow fell in the final days of December in the year 1610. The Palatine led an armed party up to the castle of Csejte and entered it. And from that moment, Elizabeth Bathory's freedom was over. Several of her servants, the people closest to her household, the ones who had served her for years, were seized and taken away to be interrogated. And here we arrive at the black heart of the entire case, the thing that every honest account must reckon with. The confessions that damned her were extracted under torture. In the legal world of that time, torture was a routine tool of interrogation, and the servants were subjected to it. Under that kind of agony, human beings will say anything, will confess to anything, will name any name, will agree to any horror their questioners suggest, simply to make the pain stop. This is not a modern excuse. It was understood even then that torture produced whatever the torturer wanted to hear. The testimony gathered from these terrified, broken servants became the foundation of the case against the Countess. A handful of them were quickly tried and put to death for their supposed part in the crimes. The trial was swift, the outcome was never in doubt. And it was in this proceeding, built on tortured confessions, that the most famous number in the whole story was born. The figure of 650 victims, the number that makes Elizabeth Bathory the worst murderer in history, has a very specific and very shaky origin. It did not come from 650 bodies. It did not come from 650 names, or graves, or grieving families. It came, according to the record, from a single witness who claimed that another servant had spoken of a book, a private register kept by the Countess herself, in which she had supposedly recorded the names of her victims, and that this book listed 650 of them. A witness describing a book that a different person had allegedly seen. And that book, the one piece of physical evidence that could have proven the most shocking claim ever made against a human being, was never produced. It was never entered into the record. It was never found. It has never been seen by anyone, then or since. The number that has echoed for 4 centuries, the number printed in 100 books and splashed across 1,000 screens, rests entirely on hearsay about a document that no one can show exists. The confessions themselves, extracted under torture, gave much smaller and wildly inconsistent numbers. The truth is that no one knows how many people really died, or exactly how or how much of the testimony was real, and how much was pain-speaking, or fear, or the careful steering of the men who ran the interrogation. The most famous fact about the Blood Countess may be the least supported one in her entire story. And here is perhaps the strangest detail of all. Elizabeth Bathory herself was never actually put on trial. Her servants were tried and executed, but the Countess, the supposed author of these crimes, the woman whose name would become a byword for evil, was never given a proper, open, public trial of her own. This is extraordinary. If the case against her was as overwhelming as the legend insists, why not try her? Why not parade the evidence, produce the terrible book, let the whole kingdom see the monster condemned? One answer that many historians find persuasive is uncomfortable. A real trial was dangerous. A woman of her rank, from a family that powerful, put on open trial, might have fought back. She might have called witnesses of her own. She might have exposed the debts, the land, the political motives, the interests of the very men accusing her. An open trial could have turned into a scandal that splashed onto the crown itself. Silence was safer, and so, instead of a trial, they simply made her disappear. Elizabeth Bathory was confined within her own castle, walled into a set of rooms, according to the enduring tradition, sealed away from the world, allowed to live, but never again to be free, never to speak in her own defense before any court. There she remained, shut away in the stone heart of Csejte for the last years of her life. She died in that confinement in 1614, still uncondemned by any court of law, her guilt never formally proven, her side of the story never heard. And with her lands and fortunes now conveniently in play, the men who had brought her down moved on. So where then does the blood come from? The bathing in the blood of virgins, the vampire, the image that made her immortal. Here is the twist that changes everything. That detail, the most iconic thing about the Blood Countess, the thing everyone knows, does not appear in the trial records at all. No witness at the time, not even under torture, described the Countess bathing in blood. It is simply not there in the original accounts. The bloodbath was invented later. It first appears in print more than 100 years after her death, in the writings of a churchman scholar who collected the local legends that had grown up around her name in the intervening century, and it was embellished and dramatized by later writers still. Think about what that means. For over a century, in the folk memory of the region, The story of the powerful, disgraced countess grew in the dark, twisting and swelling the way legends do, until a writer set the fully grown myth down on paper as though it were fact, and from there it spread across Europe and into the modern imagination, feeding vampire tales and horror films and the popular idea of her as history's greatest monster. The woman died in 1614. The monster was assembled slowly, over generations, out of rumour and imagination, and the irresistible appeal of a beautiful noblewoman turned bloodthirsty fiend. The legend is real, it is just not evidence. So what is the truth about Elizabeth Bathory? The honest answer is that we may never fully know, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a story. It is entirely possible that real cruelty happened in that castle, that servant girls suffered and died at the hands of a household that treated them as disposable, in an age that gave the powerful almost total impunity over the powerless. That would be a genuine horror, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dissolved into a fairy tale. But it is equally clear that the case as history received it is deeply compromised, built on tortured confessions, inflated by an unprovable number, driven by men with powerful financial and political motives, and finished off not with justice, but with a woman sealed in silence and never allowed to answer. And it is beyond doubt that the most famous elements of her legend, the bloodbath, the 650, the vampire, are later inventions laid over the real events like paint over stone. The truth is that Elizabeth Bathory sits forever in the space between two possibilities, and both are chilling in their own way. Either she was one of the most terrible killers who ever lived, or she was the target of one of the most effective character assassinations in all of history. A woman whose real crime, in the eyes of the men around her, may simply have been holding too much power while being impossible to control. A monster, or the perfect victim. The evidence, 400 years on, still refuses to choose. That was the truth behind the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Bathory, born into one of the mightiest families in Europe, educated and powerful in an age that feared powerful women, mistress of castles and fortunes, and a fortune owed to her by the king himself. A widow brought down in the final days of 1610 by the second most powerful man in the kingdom, a kinsman with every reason to want her ruined. Condemned on confessions torn out under torture, damned by a number that rests on a book no one has ever seen, and denied the one thing that might have cleared or truly convicted her, an open trial. Walled away in her own castle to die in silence, while her lands and the crown's debt quietly resolved themselves in favour of the men who accused her. And then, over the century that followed, transformed by legend into something she almost certainly never was, a vampire bathing in blood, the greatest monster in history, a story so vivid that it swallowed the real woman whole. Whether she was guilty of terrible things, innocent of most of them, or something tangled in between, one truth stands clear above all the rest. The legend everyone knows is not the history that actually happened, and the gap between the two is where the real, far darker and far more human story has been waiting all along. Find the full story in the Paladin Learn History app.